The first thing I saw when I pulled up was my suitcase sitting on the porch. It was standing upright, exactly the way I'd left it years ago, in airport terminals and motel hallways. Except now it was framed by a wreath I hadn't bought and a welcome mat that didn't belong to me. The house looked the same from the street. White siding, narrow windows, the maple tree out front losing its leaves earlier than usual. But the suitcase told me everything had already changed. I sat in my car for a full 30 seconds with the engine running, hands still on the steering wheel. I'd driven 6 hours to get here. I'd imagined this moment the entire way, walking into my parents' house, sitting at the kitchen table, hearing my mother's voice, my father's cough, the ordinary sounds of family life, filling in the gaps after a hard year. Instead, my bag was waiting outside like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. My name is Claire Whitman. I was 31 years old that fall, newly promoted at a regional consulting firm in Chicago, exhausted in the way people are when they've spent too many years proving themselves to everyone but their own family. I hadn't come home for Thanksgiving in 3 years. Work, they said. Distance, they said. Everyone understood. Apparently, they understood a little too well. I shut off the engine and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and chimney smoke. It was late November in Ohio, the kind of cold that settles into your joints without asking permission. I stood there staring at the suitcase, my suitcase, the one I dropped off in my old bedroom the night before I flew back to Chicago in September. I hadn't taken it with me because I'd planned to return for Christmas, or so I thought. The front door opened before I could reach the porch. My sister Lillian stood there barefoot, wrapped in one of my mother's old cardigans. Her hair was pulled into a loose bun, the way she wore it when she wanted to look effortlessly overwhelmed. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh," she said. "You're early?" "Early." It was Thanksgiving morning. I looked past her into the house. The hallway looked narrower. The walls were a different color. The framed photo of me at my college graduation was gone, replaced by a blown-up engagement portrait of Lillian and her fiancé Mark. I hadn't known it was already printed. "Why is my suitcase outside?" I asked. She followed my gaze, then shrugged lightly as if the answer were obvious. "Mom thought it would be easier." "Easier for who?" "For everyone," she said, and stepped aside to let me in. I carried my suitcase myself. No one offered to help. The handle rattled as I dragged it across the threshold. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted turkey, a smell that should have felt comforting. Instead, it made my chest tighten. My father was in the living room adjusting the television volume. He glanced at me, nodded once, then went back to the screen. "Hi, Dad," I said. "Hey, Claire," he replied without looking away. Long drive. 6 hours. Traffic. A bit. That was it. My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She hugged me quickly, the way you hug someone when you're afraid of lingering too long. "You look tired," she said. "I am?" "Well," she replied. Already turning back toward the kitchen, we're almost ready to eat. I stood there with my suitcase by my side, feeling like I had walked into the wrong house on the wrong day. My old room was at the end of the hallway. I started toward it out of habit more than intention. "Oh," my mother said sharply. "Claire, wait." I turned. We moved some things around. Something in her tone made my stomach drop. "Your room is being used right now," she continued. "Lillian needed space with the wedding planning. You can put your things in the guest room." The guest room? The one that had always been filled with storage boxes and broken furniture. I didn't argue. I nodded, picked up my suitcase again, and followed her upstairs. The guest room door was open. The boxes were gone. The bed was made. On the nightstand sat a binder labeled "Wedding Vendors" in Lillian's handwriting. I set my suitcase down slowly. "Where are my things?" I asked. My mother hesitated. Just for a second, long enough for me to notice. "We consolidated," she said. "Some went to the basement. Some went to storage." "What about my desk, my files?" "Oh, honey," she said, touching my arm lightly. "You don't live here anymore." The words landed quietly, but they hit hard. I looked at her hand on my sleeve, then back at her face. She didn't look cruel. She looked relieved, like she'd finally said something she'd been carrying for a while. Downstairs, I could hear laughter, Lillian's voice bright and animated, Mark's deeper tone joining in. They sounded at home. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder, something steadier. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't poor communication or bad timing. Decisions had been made, plans laid, space claimed, and no one had bothered to tell me. When we sat down to eat, an hour later, my place at the table was at the far end, near the kitchen door. My father carved the turkey. My mother passed the dishes. Lillian talked about venues, flowers, guest lists. She mentioned the backyard. "The backyard?" I asked. "Yes," she said brightly. "For the ceremony, it's perfect." "Our backyard," I repeated. She smiled at me, patient and indulgent. Mom and Dad said it made sense. I looked at them. My mother avoided my eyes. My father cleared his throat. "It's family property," he said. "We'll figure out the details later." Family property. I swallowed and nodded the way I always had, the way I'd been trained to. But somewhere between the cranberry sauce and the pumpkin pie, I understood something I'd never let myself see before. I wasn't being included. I was being managed. And whatever this was going to cost me, they had already decided I could afford it. The realization didn't explode. It settled. And that was the moment the story truly began. That night I didn't sleep. The guest room mattress dipped in the middle like it had given up years ago, and no one thought it was worth replacing. The house creaked in unfamiliar ways every sound, reminding me that I was no longer synced to this space. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling fan, watching it wobble slightly, as it turned, thinking about how easily routines can erase people when no one is paying attention. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, careful. A door opening, then another closing. Lillian's laugh floated briefly through the wall, low and intimate, followed by Mark's voice. They were using my old room. I didn't need to see it to know. The realization sat heavy in my chest, not because I missed the room itself, but because of what it symbolized. Something that had been mine was now theirs, and everyone was acting like that was the natural order of things. By morning, I was calm in a way that surprised me. Thanksgiving sunlight filtered weakly through the guest room curtains. I showered, dressed, and went downstairs before anyone else was fully awake. The kitchen was quiet. I poured myself coffee and stood at the counter listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The ordinary sounds steadied me. When my parents came in, they greeted me politely. Not warmly, not coldly, just politely, like coworkers who had already discussed something without me. "We should talk later," my mother said, adjusting a stack of plates. "Sure," I replied. Lillian came down last, glowing in the way people do when they feel supported. She kissed my mother on the cheek, hugged my father, then turned to me. "Thanks for being flexible," she said. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't cruel, she never had been. She was efficient. She took up space the way she'd been taught to. I had been taught to make room. "What's the plan for today?" I asked. "Well," she said, sipping her coffee, "Mark's parents are coming by later to see the house. We thought we'd show them the yard." I nodded. "And after Christmas," my father added, "we'll need to talk about some paperwork." That got my attention. "What kind of paperwork?" He waved a hand vaguely. Nothing urgent, just family business. Family business. Another phrase that meant decisions were being made without my input. I spent the rest of the morning watching, not confronting, watching, the way my mother deferred to Lillian without thinking, the way my father framed every change as temporary even though nothing about it felt that way, the way my sister spoke about the house as if it were already hers. After lunch, I went down to the basement. It smelled like dust and old paint. Boxes were stacked along the walls, some labeled in my mother's handwriting. Others weren't labeled at all. I found a plastic bin, shoved behind the washing machine, and pulled it out. Inside were my things. Not arranged, not sorted. Just placed there like items that no longer had a designated place. My college notebooks. A framed photo of my grandmother, old tax documents. A leather folder I recognized immediately. I froze when I opened it. Inside were copies of bank statements, mortgage documents. My name was on them, mine alone. I sat on the concrete floor, the chill seeping through my jeans, and read every page carefully. I remembered signing these years ago, right after my grandmother passed, and left me the down payment money. I'd bought this house so my parents wouldn't have to worry after Dad's layoff. At the time, it felt like the obvious thing to do. What I hadn't done was talk about it. I had assumed everyone remembered. Apparently, they remembered differently. That afternoon, while Lillian and Mark walked Mark's parents through the backyard, pointing out where the arch would go and where the chairs would be set up, I stayed inside. My father hovered near the window, nodding along as if he were the host. No one introduced me. I went upstairs and closed the guest room door. I sat on the bed with the folder in my lap and thought about all the times I'd been told I was independent, strong, low maintenance. What no one ever said out loud was that those traits made me easy to sideline. That evening, after the guests left and the house settled into its usual quiet, my mother knocked on the guest room door. "Claire," she said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded and followed her into the living room. My father sat in his armchair. Lillian perched on the couch, legs tucked under her hands folded over her stomach. "We've been thinking my mother began that since you're doing so well on your own. Maybe it's time we formalize some things." "Formalize what?" I asked. "The house," my father said. "The future." Lillian looked at me, then her expression earnest. "It just makes sense. Mark and I will be starting a family soon. Stability is important." "And my role in this?" I asked. They exchanged glances. "Well," my mother said carefully, "you live in Chicago now. You have your career. This place has become our home." I waited, let the silence stretch. "So you want me to sign something?" I said finally. "No one is forcing you," my father replied quickly. "We just think it's fair." Fair, that word again. I stood up slowly. "I need some air," I said. No one stopped me. Outside, the cold hit my face hard enough to make my eyes water. I stood on the porch, looking out at the yard where chairs would soon be arranged for a wedding I hadn't been asked to help plan. I thought about the folder in my room, about the documents, about how quietly ownership can be rewritten when the owner isn't present. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in years. Daniel Harper. He'd been my grandmother's lawyer, a man who spoke plainly and didn't soften facts to spare feelings. When he answered, his voice was steady. "Daniel," I said. "This is Claire Whitman. I have a question about a house." There was a pause. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. And just like that, the ground beneath me shifted again. Not with fear, with clarity. Daniel Harper didn't ask me to explain everything at once. That was the first thing I noticed. He told me to sit down somewhere quiet, to take a breath, and then to tell him only what I knew for certain. Not what I felt, not what I feared, just the facts. It was the same way my grandmother used to talk when she wanted me to think clearly instead of emotionally. I stood on the porch while I spoke, the phone cold against my ear, my breath visible in the air. I told him I had purchased the house 7 years earlier. I told him my name was on the mortgage and the deed. I told him my parents had lived there since my grandmother died and that I'd never charged them rent. I told him I lived out of state now, but returned for holidays. I told him my sister was planning a wedding in the backyard and that paperwork had been mentioned. Vaguely, casually, Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Claire," he said finally, "have you signed anything related to this house since the original purchase?" "No." "Given power of attorney?" "No." "Added anyone to the deed?" "No." Another pause. Then legally, he said, "Nothing has changed." I leaned against the porch railing, my legs suddenly unsteady. "What about practically?" I asked. "Because practically, I feel like I walked into someone else's life." "That's different," he replied, "and more common than you think." He explained things slowly, carefully. The difference between permission and ownership. The way families fill space when no boundaries are spoken. How time and assumption can create an illusion of entitlement if no one stops it early. "Right now," he said, "you are still the sole owner of that property. Your parents and your sister are occupants by permission, not by right." The word permission echoed in my head. "So if they ask me to sign something," I said, "what should I do?" "You should not sign anything without legal review," he said immediately. "And if they're already discussing documents without you, that's a red flag." I thanked him and ended the call. I stayed outside longer than necessary, letting the cold calm the heat building behind my ribs. Through the living room window, I could see silhouettes moving. My family, my house, my absence made visible. When I went back inside, the mood had shifted. My mother was folding laundry on the couch. My father watched television with the volume turned too low. Lillian stood at the kitchen counter scrolling on her phone. No one asked where I'd been. I went upstairs and pulled the leather folder from my suitcase. I laid the documents out on the bed and read them again, slower this time. My name appeared over and over. Claire Whitman. Borrower. Owner. Responsible party. I realized something then that made my throat tighten. They weren't confused. They were counting on me being quiet. That night after dinner, Lillian knocked on my door. She leaned against the frame like she always had growing up, casual, familiar. "Mom says you seemed upset earlier," she said. "I wasn't upset," I replied. "I was thinking." She smiled thinly. "About the house?" "Yes." She stepped inside without asking and sat on the edge of the bed. "I know this is weird for you," she said, "but things change. You've built a life somewhere else." "That doesn't erase this one," I said. She sighed. "Claire, don't make this harder than it needs to be." There it was. Harder for who? "I heard Dad mention paperwork," I said evenly. "What exactly is being planned?" Her eyes flicked away for just a second. "Long enough." "It's just to make things official," she said. "You know, for the future." "For whose future?" She stood up. "Why are you interrogating me?" "I'm asking," I said. "Because my name is on the house." She laughed, but it wasn't kind. "That's technical?" I watched her closely. Technical things are the ones that last. Her expression changed then. The warmth drained away, replaced by irritation. "You've always been like this," she snapped. "You get distant, then you swoop back in and act like you own everything." I didn't raise my voice. "I do own it." Silence. She stared at me, searching for something. A crack, an apology. I gave her neither. "Look," she said, finally, softer now. "Mark and I need stability. Mom and Dad aren't getting younger. This house has become the center of all of us. You're visiting." The word landed exactly where she intended it to. I nodded slowly. "Then we need to be very clear about what visiting means." Her jaw tightened. "You're being selfish." I smiled faintly. "That's new." She left without another word. The next day, my father asked me to run errands with him. We drove in silence for a while before he spoke. "You've always been independent," he said. "That's something I admire." I waited. "Your sister needs support," he continued. "She's building a family." "So am I said quietly, "just not in the same way." He frowned. "You don't need this house." The sentence wasn't cruel. It was matter of fact. and that was what made it dangerous. That afternoon, while everyone else napped or scrolled or pretended nothing was wrong, I called Daniel back. "I need copies of everything," I said, "and I want to understand my options." "Good," he replied, "because it sounds like they're assuming you won't push back." "I don't plan to argue," I said. "I plan to be precise." Precision, I was learning, scared people more than anger ever could. That evening, I overheard my mother on the phone in the kitchen. "She's always been dramatic," she whispered, "but she'll calm down." I stood at the top of the stairs, unseen, listening. She has her career. She'll sign eventually. Eventually. That night, I packed my suitcase again. Not to leave. Not yet, but to remind myself that I could. As I zipped it closed, my phone buzzed. An email from Daniel. Attached were the deed, the mortgage, and a note. "Claire, everything is exactly as you remember. Sole ownership. No changes, no loopholes." I sat on the bed and stared at the screen. Downstairs, laughter floated up, plans being made, assumptions stacking quietly, confidently. They thought the hardest part would be convincing me. They were wrong. The hardest part was going to be what happened when I stopped pretending I didn't notice what they were doing, and that was coming next. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that felt almost clinical. No racing thoughts, no rehearsed arguments, just a quiet awareness that something had crossed a line and that pretending otherwise would cost me more than speaking up ever could. The house was already awake. I could hear cabinets opening, the clink of mugs, the low murmur of morning news from the living room. Ordinary sounds layered over something tense and unspoken. I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but intention. Neutral colors. Nothing that suggested I was visiting, nothing that suggested I was leaving either. At the kitchen table, my father was reading the paper. My mother stood at the counter slicing fruit. Lillian breezed in late, phone pressed to her ear, laughing softly at something Mark said on the other end. I poured coffee and sat down. "We need to talk," I said. 3 heads turned toward me at once. "Now," my mother asked. "It's early." "Now is fine," I replied. Lillian ended her call and slid into a chair, crossing her arms. My father folded the newspaper with exaggerated care. "What's going on?" he asked. I took a breath. I spoke with Daniel Harper. My mother stiffened. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "I disagree." Silence settled in the room. Not heavy, not explosive, watchful. He confirmed that I am the sole legal owner of this house, I continued. Nothing has changed. No paperwork. No transfer. No shared ownership. My father's jaw tightened. Lillian stared at the table. So my mother said carefully, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I replied, "that conversations about paperwork, weddings, and long-term plans involving this house need to include me. Fully. Not after decisions are made." Lillian laughed, sharp and brittle. "You're making this sound like some kind of takeover." "No," I said evenly. "I'm correcting a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," she snapped. "This is our family home." "Yes," I said, "and I own it." The words didn't come out harsh. They didn't need to. My father pushed his chair back slightly. "Claire, don't do this." "Do what?" "Turn this into a legal thing." "It already is," I replied. "You just haven't been treating it that way." My mother shook her head. "After everything we've done for you." There it was. The old leverage. Care disguised as debt. "I'm grateful," I said. "That doesn't mean I disappear." Lillian stood up. "You live in Chicago. You don't even need this place." "That's not for you to decide." Her eyes flashed. "You're choosing control over family." I met her gaze calmly. "I'm choosing reality." The room fell quiet again. My father rubbed his forehead, a habit he had when he felt cornered. "So what do you want?" he asked. I had thought about that question all night. "I want my room back," I said. "I want my belongings returned to where they were. And I want any future plans involving this house to stop until we've agreed on boundaries." Lillian scoffed. "The nursery's already set up." "That was done without my consent," I replied. "You didn't say no," she shot back. "I wasn't asked." That landed. My mother sank into the chair. "This is all very sudden." "It's been building for years," I said quietly. I just stopped ignoring it. No one spoke for a moment. Finally, my father said, "We'll talk about it later." "No," I said gently. "Later is how this happened." The firmness in my voice surprised even me. "I'm not asking you to leave," I continued. "I'm asking you to recognize that this isn't something you get to quietly take over." Lillian looked at me as if she were seeing a stranger. "You've changed." "Yes," I said. I had to. I stood up, took my coffee, and walked toward the hallway. My hands were steady. My heart was calm. Behind me, I heard my mother whisper something. I didn't turn around. In my old room, now painted and rearranged beyond recognition, I stood in the doorway and took it in. The unfamiliar furniture. The boxes labeled baby. The absence of anything that suggested I had ever existed here. This wasn't just about space. It was about erasure. That afternoon, I drove to a small storage facility on the edge of town. Daniel had sent me an address. I unlocked the unit and stepped inside. My things were there. All of them. Labeled, stacked, forgotten. I ran my hand over a box marked Claire, office. I didn't cry. I smiled, because this meant something important. They hadn't gotten rid of me. They'd just moved me out of sight. And now they were about to realize that putting someone away quietly doesn't mean they stay gone. That evening when I returned home, the house felt different, quieter, watchful. Lillian avoided me. My mother moved around nervously. My father barely spoke. I went upstairs and sat on the guest bed, the folder from Daniel open in my lap. There was one document I hadn't mentioned yet, one option I hadn't voiced. I didn't need to threaten. I didn't need to argue. All I needed was time and a pen, and they had no idea how close I was to using both. The next 3 days passed in a strange, careful quiet. No one said the wrong thing. No one said the right thing either. The house moved around me like it was afraid of making noise. Doors closed softly. Footsteps paused when I entered a room. Conversations stopped just before I came close enough to hear them clearly. This was how my family handled conflict. Not by resolving it, but by waiting to see who would blink first. I didn't blink. On Sunday morning, my father asked if I wanted eggs. It was the first direct question he'd asked me since our conversation in the kitchen. Yes, I said. Thank you. He nodded and turned back to the stove. My mother set a plate in front of me without comment. Lillian didn't come down until late, wrapped in a robe, eyes puffy, phone already in her hand. She glanced at me once, then looked away. I ate quietly, listening. Not for words, but for patterns. I noticed how my father still paid the utility bills from his checking account, even though the mortgage came from mine. I noticed how my mother referred to our house when talking to friends, never correcting herself. I noticed how Lillian had stopped talking about the wedding in front of me entirely, as if excluding me again was safer than including me honestly. That afternoon, I drove back to the storage unit. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I unlocked the door and stepped inside the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air smelled like cardboard and dust. I walked slowly between the stacks of boxes, reading labels in my mother's handwriting. Seasonal, kitchen, extras, old photos, Claire, Miss K. Misk! I opened the box and sat on the concrete floor. Inside were pieces of my life that had been removed efficiently without ceremony. Framed certificates, childhood drawings I'd made for my grandmother, a small jewelry box my mother had given me years ago, empty now. At the bottom was a manila envelope. I recognized it immediately. It was the copy of my grandmother's will. My hand stilled. I hadn't seen this envelope since the day she died. I remembered sitting at her kitchen table with Daniel Harper, my mother crying quietly, my father staring at the floor. I remembered being surprised when my grandmother left me the down payment money instead of splitting it evenly. She knew you'd be careful with it, Daniel had said then. I opened the envelope now and scanned the pages. Everything was exactly as I remembered. Clear, specific, no ambiguity. And then I noticed something I hadn't before. A handwritten note folded and tucked into the back. Claire, if you're rating this later than you expected, it means something I worried about has happened. This money, this house was never meant to be a gift that bound you. It was meant to give you ground to stand on when people forget to make space for you. Do not let kindness be used as leverage against you. You deserve stability too. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. I sat there for a long time, the storage unit silent around me, and understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't new. This pattern had existed long before the wedding, long before Chicago, long before Thanksgiving. I had just finally stepped far enough away to see it. That evening, when I returned to the house, my mother was on the phone in the living room. She lowered her voice when she saw me, but not quickly enough. She's being very difficult, she said. I don't know what's gotten into her. I went upstairs without comment and closed the guest room door. I didn't confront her. I opened my laptop instead. I pulled up my bank records, mortgage statements, insurance documents, property tax payments. Every record showed the same thing: consistency, responsibility, ownership. Then I drafted an email, not to my family, to Daniel. I kept it short. Daniel, I need to understand what formal steps I can take to clarify boundaries without escalating into eviction. Please advise. I hit send and closed the laptop. Downstairs, laughter erupted suddenly. Lillian's voice, Mark's voice on speakerphone. Wedding plans resumed now that they thought I'd gone quiet again. They misunderstood my silence. I wasn't retreating. I was organizing. The next morning, Daniel replied, Claire, there are several options. The least confrontational is a written occupancy agreement outlining expectations and confirming that residence is by permission, not ownership. It does not remove anyone immediately, but it establishes reality in writing. I read the email twice. An occupancy agreement, not an eviction, not a threat. A line. That afternoon, my father knocked on the guest room door. Can we talk? He asked. Scared. I nodded and followed him into the dining room. He sat across from me, hands folded, posture stiff. Your mother is upset, he said. I know. She feels like you don't trust us. I trust facts, I replied. That hasn't changed. He sighed. Lillian is under a lot of stress. So am I. He looked at me. really looked for the first time in days. You've always been strong. I didn't answer. You don't need this house, he said again, softer this time. I don't need it, I agreed, but I own it. The distinction seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. What are you planning to do, he asked. I'm planning to be clear, I said. So no one is confused later? His mouth tightened. That sounds like a warning. It's not, I said. It's documentation. He stood up abruptly. This feels unnecessary. I remained seated. It feels overdue. That night I printed the draft Daniel sent me. 4 pages. Simple language. No accusations. Just structure. Expectations. Acknowledgement of ownership. I placed the papers in my bag and went to bed early. As I lay there listening to the house breathe around me, I felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. Not guilt. Resolve. Because I finally understood this wasn't about taking something away from them. It was about taking myself back. And once I did that, there would be no going back to the way things were. I didn't bring the papers out right away. That was intentional. I wanted to see what would happen when I stopped reacting and started existing like someone who belonged. I made coffee in the mornings without asking. I rearranged a few things in the kitchen so I could find them. I took calls in the living room instead of retreating upstairs. Small, ordinary acts. The kind that shouldn't matter, but somehow did. They noticed. My mother hovered whenever I opened a cabinet. Lillian paused in doorways, watching me like she was trying to calculate something. My father grew quieter, his movements careful, as if the house itself had become fragile. On Tuesday afternoon, Mark came over unexpectedly. I was at the dining table reviewing a work document when he walked in jacket, still on keys in his hand. He stopped when he saw me, clearly surprised. Oh, hey, he said. I didn't know you were here. I looked up. I live here. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. He flushed slightly. Right, yeah, I know what you meant, I said calmly. He shifted his weight. Lillian's upstairs. I'm aware. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. She's been pretty stressed, I imagine. She feels like you're pulling away. I set my papers down. I didn't pull away. I was pushed aside. He frowned. I don't think anyone meant it that way. Intent doesn't change impact. That ended the conversation. He nodded awkwardly and went upstairs. A few minutes later, I heard raised voices, not shouting, tight, controlled, the kind that hurts more because it's careful. That evening, my mother cornered me in the kitchen. You embarrassed Mark, she said. I stated a fact. You could have been gentler. I could have, I agreed, but I wasn't wrong. She pressed her lips together. You're making this house tense. No, I said quietly. I'm refusing to absorb tension that isn't mine. She stared at me, searching for something. An apology, a crack. I gave her neither. That night, I finally pulled the papers from my bag. I waited until after dinner, when everyone was in the living room pretending to watch television. I set the stack on the coffee table without a word and sat down. What's that, my father asked. An occupancy agreement, I said. Lillian's head snapped up. What? It outlines expectations for anyone living here, I continued. It confirms that residency is by permission, not ownership. You're serious, she said flatly. Yes. My mother reached for the papers, hands shaking slightly. She skimmed the first page, then the second. Her face paled. This makes us sound like tenants, she said. It makes you occupants, I replied, which is accurate. My father stood up. This is too far. I stayed seated. It's 4 pages of clarity. Lillian grabbed the papers from my mother's hands and scanned them quickly. Her breathing sped up. So this is it, she said. You're drawing lines now. I'm acknowledging them, I said. You didn't need to do this, she snapped. We're family. I looked at her. Family doesn't erase reality. She laughed sharply. You're really going to make Mom and Dad sign something? I'm asking, I said, not forcing. My father slammed his hand on the arm of the couch. This feels like a threat. It's not, I replied evenly. It's a safeguard. For who, my mother asked. For me, I said. Silence filled the room, thick, heavy. Lillian stood up abruptly. You're doing this right before my wedding. You planned a wedding in my backyard without asking, I said. Timing wasn't my choice. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't soften her voice. You're selfish. I nodded once. I'm finally choosing myself. That broke something. My mother sat down hard on the couch. My father stared at the floor. Lillian turned away, shoulders shaking, and stormed upstairs. No one signed anything that night. I didn't expect them to. Later, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. If they refuse to sign, the agreement still serves as notice. It establishes that boundaries were communicated. Let me know how you want to proceed. I stared at the message for a long time. Down the hall, a door slammed, then another. Voices rose and fell. Arguments I wasn't part of anymore. For the first time since I arrived, I felt separate from the chaos. Not isolated. Independent. I turned off my phone and closed my eyes. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be quiet. And it wouldn't be mine to absorb alone. The morning after I put the papers on the table, the house felt like it was holding its breath. No one spoke to me at breakfast. My mother moved around the kitchen without looking up. My father left early, claiming errands that didn't need running. Lillian didn't come downstairs at all. I heard her pacing above my head, the slow creak of floorboards, tracing a path back and forth like a restless metronome. I finished my coffee, rinsed my mug, and set it in the drying rack. No announcement, no apology, just presence. Around 10, my phone rang. "Daniel, they didn't sign, did they?" he asked. "No. That's expected," he said calmly. "What did they do instead?" "They went quiet," he exhaled. "That's usually the middle phase." "Middle of what?" "Control loss," he replied. Silence comes before escalation. I looked out the kitchen window at the bare maple tree, its branches thin and exposed. What should I do? "Nothing reactive," he said, "but I recommend documenting what happens next." That afternoon, escalation arrived wearing a familiar face. My Aunt Renee pulled into the driveway just after lunch. She hadn't called ahead. She never did when she was coming to mediate. She walked in like she owned the place, coat still on purse tucked under her arm. "Claire," she said, arms already opening. "There you are." I hugged her politely, nothing more. She glanced around the house, then lowered her voice. "Your mother is beside herself." "I'm aware." She led me into the living room and sat us down like this was an intervention. "You've upset the balance," she said gently. "I corrected it," I replied. She sighed. "You know how your sister is." "Yes. And your parents," she continued. "They're not getting any younger." "That doesn't change facts." She reached for my hand. I let her take it, but my arm stayed relaxed. "Sweetheart, this isn't about facts. It's about family." "There's a difference," I said. She frowned. "Why are you doing this now?" "Because now is when it became clear," I replied. She shook her head. "Your grandmother would hate this." I looked at her. "My grandmother paid for this house." That stopped her. She withdrew her hand slowly. "Still," she said after a moment, "there are better ways." "I'm open to hearing one," I said. She didn't have one. An hour later, she left, her tone cooler than when she arrived. The message was clear. They were gathering allies. By evening, my phone buzzed again. A text from my cousin, then another from an old family friend, variations of the same theme. "We're worried about your parents. This feels extreme. Why can't you just let this go?" I didn't respond. Instead, I opened a notebook and started writing. Dates, names, conversations, who said what, who implied what, no emotion, just record. Around 9, Lillian finally came downstairs. Her eyes were red, but her posture was rigid. She stood across from me in the living room, arms crossed, jaw set. "They're all talking," she said. "I know. You're making us look terrible. I didn't speak to anyone." "But you didn't stop them," she snapped. "That's not my job." She laughed bitterly. "You really think you're right, don't you?" "I think I'm clear." She stepped closer. "You always needed to win." I shook my head slowly. No, I needed to stop losing quietly. Her face crumpled for a second before hardening again. "If you go through with this," she said, "you're going to ruin everything." "I didn't start this," I replied. "I'm ending it." She stared at me, then turned and walked back upstairs. Later that night, my father knocked on my door. He stood there longer than necessary before speaking. "You've put us in a bad position." "I put myself in a truthful one," I said. He looked tired, older, smaller. "People are asking questions," he said. "They should have asked me first," I replied. He swallowed. "What do you want?" I considered him carefully. "I want acknowledgement." He frowned. "Of what?" "That this house is mine," I said, "and that staying here is not an entitlement." He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "And if we can't give you that, then we'll need to discuss timelines," I said, calmly. That word landed heavy between us. He nodded once and left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it. Not because I was weak, but because I was steady enough to feel the weight of what was coming. They had tried silence. They had tried pressure. Next would come the choice, and this time I wasn't the one avoiding it. The first real crack came 3 days later, disguised as a compromise. I came home from a long walk to find my father and mother sitting at the dining table with a folder between them. The posture was familiar. This was how decisions used to be delivered when I was younger. Already discussed. Already agreed upon. My role was to receive. "Sit down," my father said. I did. My mother slid the folder toward me. Inside was a single typed page. "We talked to someone from church," she said. "He knows about these things." I scanned the paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a proposal, polite language, soft edges, a suggestion that ownership be shared in spirit if not formally, that Lillian and Mark be allowed to proceed with the wedding plans, that everyone continue living together as family with the understanding that nothing would be sold or changed without discussion. There was no acknowledgement of the deed, no mention of permission, just a quiet attempt to reset the board without changing the pieces. "I'm not signing this," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "This is reasonable." "It avoids reality," I replied. My mother leaned forward. "Why are you being so rigid?" "I'm being accurate." "That paper you brought," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It makes us feel disposable." I met her eyes. I felt disposable when my room disappeared. She looked away. My father tapped the table. "You're willing to tear the family apart over technicalities." I shook my head slowly. "You already did that when you decided my absence meant forfeiture." Lillian appeared in the doorway, drawn by raised voices. She took in the scene quickly. "So this is it," she said. "You're rejecting the olive branch." "This isn't an olive branch," I replied. "It's avoidance." She scoffed. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I said evenly. "I'm enduring it." That night, I emailed Daniel again. They're attempting informal agreements that avoid acknowledging ownership. What's the next step? His reply came within the hour. If they won't acknowledge reality voluntarily, clarity has to come from structure. That usually means formal notice. I read that line several times. Formal notice! The next morning, my father didn't speak to me. My mother cried quietly in the kitchen. Lillian left early and didn't return until late. I spent the day packing. Not everything, just enough to remind myself I could leave if I chose to. Clothes, important documents, the folder from Daniel. I placed them neatly in my suitcase, zipped it halfway, and left it by the door. No announcement, just presence. When Lillian came home and saw it, she froze. "You're leaving," she said flatly. "Not yet," I replied. She swallowed. "You're trying to scare us." "I'm showing you what's possible," I said. She stared at the suitcase like it was a threat. That evening, my father finally spoke. "If you do this," he said quietly, "there's no going back." I looked at him. "There already isn't?" He nodded slowly, as if accepting something he didn't like, but could no longer deny. That night, I drafted a timeline. Not an eviction, not an ultimatum, a structured plan, options, dates, clear expectations, respectful language. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I printed it. As the printer hummed, I realized it's something with startling clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was alignment. And once things align, everything that doesn't belong begins to fall away on its own. I folded the papers, placed them in my bag, and walked downstairs. The house was quiet, but not calm. That was coming next. The formal notice didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with ink. Daniel emailed it to me just after sunrise. 2 pages. Clean language. No accusations. No threats. It stated ownership, clarified permission, and outlined options. A timeline to transition into a lease if they wished to stay, or a reasonable move-out window if they chose not to. It was firm without being cruel, precise without being cold. I printed 3 copies. I didn't rush downstairs. I made coffee. I showered. I dressed. I let my body catch up to my mind. When I finally walked into the living room, my father was already there, staring at the muted television. My mother sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. Lillian stood near the window, phone in hand, jaw set. I placed the papers on the coffee table. "What's this now?" my father asked, though he already knew. "This is formal notice," I said. "It explains the options going forward." My mother reached for it with shaking hands. Lillian grabbed her copy immediately and began reading fast, her eyes scanning for something to grab onto. "This is unbelievable," she said. "You're actually doing this." "Yes. You're forcing us," she snapped. "I'm giving structure," I replied. "You still have choices." My father picked up his copy last. He read slowly, thoroughly. The room was silent except for the soft sound of paper shifting. After a long moment, he looked up. "You talked to a lawyer," he said. "Yes." His mouth tightened, without telling us. "I tried talking first," I said. "That didn't work." My mother's eyes filled. "This feels like punishment." "It's not," I said gently. "It's protection." Lillian dropped the papers onto the table. "You're choosing paper over people." I met her gaze. "I'm choosing truth over pretense." She laughed bitterly. "You always think you're right." "I think I'm done pretending I don't see what's happening." My father leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally overtaking anger. "So what happens if we don't agree to any of this?" I answered without hesitation. "Then the timeline applies." "How long?" my mother whispered. 90 days, I said. "Reasonable, documented." The word documented seemed to land hardest. Lillian turned towards my mother. "She's serious?" "I've been serious the whole time," I said. No one spoke for a while. The house seemed to listen. Finally, my father stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He just said, "I need air," and walked out the front door. My mother stayed seated, tears slipping quietly down her face. Lillian paced, then stopped in front of me. "You think this makes you strong," she said. "But all it does is prove you never really belonged here." That one tried to cut deep. I held her gaze. "I belonged. You just got used to acting like I didn't." She turned away sharply. That afternoon, my phone buzzed nonstop. Relatives, family friends, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly full of concern. I didn't answer. Instead, I updated my notebook. At 6, my father returned. He sat down heavily, like a man who had finally reached the edge of denial. "We'll need time," he said. "You have it," I replied. My mother looked up. "You won't take this back?" "No." Lillian said nothing. She just stared at the floor. That night, the house felt different, not tense, grieving. I lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks, the old sounds I'd grown up with. They felt quieter now, like the house itself was settling into something honest. I wasn't angry. I wasn't satisfied. I was resolved. Because once a boundary is written down, it stops being a negotiation and starts being a fact. And facts, unlike feelings, don't change to keep people comfortable. Whatever came next, it would come on clear terms. Mine. The house began to empty itself before anyone said the word leaving. It happened in small, careful movements. A box here, a drawer cleared there, nothing announced, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet sound of things being removed piece by piece, like air slowly leaking from a sealed room. Lillian was the first to change her routine. She stopped sleeping late. She stopped pacing. She stopped pretending this was temporary. I noticed folded clothes appearing in the hallway. A stack of planners moved from the dining table to her bag. Mark's jacket disappeared from the coat rack. No one explained any of it to me. They didn't have to. My mother grew quieter. Not fragile, not dramatic, just subdued. She spent long hours in the kitchen cleaning things that were already clean, wiping counters that didn't need wiping, rearranging cabinets that had already been rearranged. Busy work. The kind that keeps your hands moving so your mind doesn't spiral. My father avoided me entirely for 2 days. When he did speak, it was about the weather, the mail, the neighbor's fence. Never about the notice, never about the timeline, never about the shift that was already in motion. I let it unfold. I didn't follow anyone into rooms. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer reassurance or explanations. That was the hardest part, not stepping in to soften things, not managing emotions that weren't mine anymore. On Thursday evening, Lillian finally broke. I was in the living room reading when she stood in the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "So you really won't reconsider," she said. I closed the book and looked at her. "There's nothing to reconsider." She scoffed. "You've always been like this, calm, cold, acting like you're above it." "I'm not above it," I said. "I'm outside it." Her eyes flashed. "You enjoy being the one with power." That accusation had teeth. I didn't deflect it. I sat with it. "No," I said slowly. "I enjoy not being powerless." She swallowed hard. "Mom can barely sleep." "I know. Dad won't talk." "I know. Do you even care?" I stood up then, not abruptly, just fully. "I care enough to stop this from happening again," I said. To me. Or to anyone else who gets pushed aside quietly. She stared at me, something in her expression shifting. Not understanding. Not yet, but recognition. Like she was seeing the cost of a pattern she had benefited from without ever questioning. She left without another word. The next morning, my father knocked on my door. He didn't wait for permission. He stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped. "We're going to take the lease option," he said. I nodded. "Okay." He seemed surprised by how little resistance there was. "Your mother needs stability right now." "I understand." He hesitated. "Lillian and Mark will be moving out sooner. They found a place closer to his work." "That makes sense." He watched my face carefully, as if looking for satisfaction. Finding none unsettled him more than anger ever could. "You're not happy about this," he said. "I'm relieved," I replied. That night, Daniel sent over the lease documents. Clear terms, clear boundaries, rent modest but real, responsibilities outlined, no ambiguity. I reviewed them carefully, then printed 2 copies. When my parents signed the next day, my mother cried softly. My father's hand shook. The pen left a faint smear of ink where he paused too long. I didn't comment. When it was done, I placed the signed lease in a folder and locked it in my suitcase. The sound of the zipper closing felt final. Lillian packed faster after that. Boxes stacked by the door, her laughter gone, her movements sharp and efficient. Mark came and went, polite but distant. The night before they left, she stood in the kitchen with me while water boiled on the stove. "I never thought it would end like this," she said quietly. "It didn't have to," I replied. She nodded once, eyes on the floor. I didn't realize how much space I was taking. I didn't say anything. Awareness when it comes this late needs room. The morning they moved out, the driveway was crowded with boxes and damp leaves. I stood on the porch, hands in my coat pockets, watching them load the last of it. Lillian paused before getting into the car. She looked at the house, then at me. "You really changed," she said. "No," I replied. I stopped shrinking. She nodded, then drove away. The house felt different immediately. Not empty, honest. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the end. This was the quiet before everything finally settled into place. After Lillian left the house, went still in a way I hadn't felt before. Not tense, not waiting, just still. The first morning without her, I woke up before my alarm. The light through the window was pale and steady. No footsteps overhead. No doors opening and closing. No whispered phone calls drifting down the hallway. I lay there for a moment, listening to the silence, and realized I wasn't bracing for anything. That was new. Downstairs, my parents moved differently now. Slower. More contained. The house no longer bent around Lillian's urgency or her plans. It returned to a smaller shape, one that fit fewer assumptions. My mother made coffee and set out 2 cups instead of 4. She hesitated before pouring the second, then did it anyway. "You're up early," she said. I slept well, I replied. She nodded like that answer surprised her. We sat at the kitchen table without talking much. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Ordinary sounds stripped of their old tension. I noticed how my mother's hands shook less when she wasn't rushing. How my father's shoulders sat lower when he didn't feel the need to defend something. A few days later, I moved back into my room. Not ceremoniously, not angrily. I carried my boxes upstairs one at a time, past the now empty nursery, past the room that had briefly held a future that was never meant to displace mine. I unpacked slowly. My clothes in the closet, my books on the shelves, the framed photo of my grandmother on the dresser. When I placed it down, I felt something click into place. This was where I had stood years ago, thinking generosity meant absence. I knew better now. My father watched me from the hallway. He didn't offer help. He didn't object. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man recalibrating his understanding of the world. I didn't think you'd actually take the room back, he said finally. I never stopped needing it, I replied. He nodded, accepting that in the way people do when they realize resistance no longer serves them. That evening, he knocked on my door. I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. I didn't mean to make you feel optional, he continued. The word seemed to cost him something. I just thought you'd always land on your feet. I looked at him. I did. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. He swallowed. I see that now. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't untangle years of patterns or erase what had happened, but it was real enough to stand on. I'm not asking you to leave, I said. I just needed things to be honest. I know, he replied. And I know this house is yours. He said it clearly, without qualifiers. That mattered. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. My parents adjusted to the lease, to paying rent, to asking before making changes. It wasn't natural for them at first. Habits like that never are. But structure has a way of teaching respect when intention alone doesn't. I returned to Chicago after Christmas with lighter luggage than I'd arrived with. Not because I left things behind, but because I no longer felt the need to carry everything at once. On my last night, I stood in the doorway of my room and looked around. The space felt like mine again. Not reclaimed through force, but restored through clarity. My mother hugged me longer than usual before I left. Drive safe, she said. Call when you get home. I will. My father loaded my suitcase into the car without comment. When he closed the trunk, he rested his hand there for a moment, then looked at me. You were right to stand your ground, he said quietly. I nodded. I had to. As I drove away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled, because the real shift hadn't happened when papers were signed or timelines were agreed upon. It happened when I stopped waiting for permission to take up space in my own life. And that was something no one could ever take from me again. The lesson wasn't loud. It didn't demand applause. It simply stayed, and it changed everything. I didn't realize how much tension I had been carrying until it was gone. Back in Chicago, my apartment felt smaller than I remembered, but lighter. The quiet there wasn't loaded with expectation or history. It was just quiet. I unpacked slowly, setting my suitcase in the closet instead of leaving it by the door. That small choice felt symbolic, even if I didn't dwell on it. The first week passed without incident. Work filled my days. Meetings, deadlines, ordinary frustrations that felt almost comforting after the emotional weight of home. At night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that doesn't require bracing. My parents called once, not to negotiate, not to revisit anything, just to tell me the furnace was acting up and they'd scheduled a repair. They asked if that was okay. Yes, I said. That was new too. Lillian didn't call. I didn't expect her to. Some distance needs to exist before it can be crossed safely. I wasn't angry about it. I understood now that not everyone processes loss at the same speed, especially when the loss is of control rather than love. A month later, Daniel emailed to check in. Everything stable. Yes, I wrote back. Quietly stable. He replied with a simple line. That's usually how lasting change looks. I thought about that often. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something subtle but profound. I stopped over-explaining myself. At work, with friends, in conversations where I used to soften my words to avoid discomfort, I spoke plainly. Not sharply. Not defensively. Just clearly. No one pushed back. It turned out that most people weren't waiting to fight me. They were waiting to see where I stood. I visited my parents again in early spring. The house looked the same from the outside, but it felt different when I stepped in. Smaller, calmer, more honest. My room was exactly as I'd left it. My mother had placed fresh flowers on the kitchen table. My father asked if I wanted coffee before pouring it. Small gestures, not dramatic, but intentional. At dinner, my father cleared his throat. We're thinking of downsizing next year, he said. Something closer to town. That sounds reasonable, I replied. My mother nodded. We don't need all that space anymore. They didn't say my name, they didn't need to. Later that night, I stood alone in the backyard. The same yard that had almost hosted a wedding that would have rewritten my place in my own life. The grass was damp with evening dew. The air smelled like soil and early blooms. I thought about how close I'd come to letting it all slide, to signing something out of exhaustion, to telling myself that love meant sacrifice even when the sacrifice was my dignity. I understood now how easy it is to confuse endurance with strength. Real strength isn't staying silent when something hurts. It's being willing to disrupt comfort to protect your future. When I left the next morning, there were no heavy conversations, no unresolved tension humming beneath polite smiles, just a clean goodbye. As I drove away, I didn't look back in the mirror. Not because I was angry, because I didn't need to. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that revenge doesn't always look like payback. Sometimes it looks like refusing to disappear. Sometimes it's choosing structure over chaos, truth over tradition, self-respect over approval. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand still in what's yours and let everyone else adjust. If you've ever been made to feel like you were asking for too much, when all you wanted was what was already yours, remember this. Boundaries aren't cruelty. Clarity isn't betrayal. And choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you free. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what standing your ground has looked like in your own life.